Hello, happy Friday, and welcome to Revealing the Data Protection Trends for 2023. Now, today's exciting webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Jess Steinbach, if I haven't met you already, and I am so excited to be your moderator for this conversation today because I get to share in the big reveal moment right alongside with you. That's right, in just a few moments, we will get our experts on out here with us, and they're going to walk us through the report, what we've learned, and then best of all, what you can do with all of those insights. This is going to be such a cool day. I cannot wait to get started. So let's zip through some of this housekeeping and get things on the road, shall we? All right, up first on our little guided tour, I want to draw your attention on over to the questions section of your webinar console. This is the absolute best place to get involved, get interactive, post all of those questions, comments, feedback. We're interacting with brand new data today. So there are going to be some questions that come up. When it does, post in that tab and we'll get some responses back to you. I do also want to remind you that that questions tab is a great way to reach out to the actual tech team. So the actual tech team. So if you're having any issues today with audio or video, anything like that, we've got a bunch of slides to go through. If anything glitches along the way, just shoot us a message in that questions window there and we will be there to help you out. I also want to remind you that a browser refresh is going to get rid of any of the usual tech gremlins, but as I said, if they're clinging on, we're there to help you right there in that questions window. If you want to give the questions window a little bit of a test run right now, say hi, say hello, reach out to the rest of the awesome folks here with us today on this lovely Friday morning, afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. The last thing I want to point out on your audience console is the handouts tab. Don't forget to spend some time exploring that. It is absolutely packed with resources and takeaways for you today. And first and foremost, make sure that you get the 2023 Data Protection Trends Report from Veeam. That's what we're here to talk about today. So make sure you've got that report downloaded because as I said, our speakers are going to go through a lot of slides. There's a lot of information. And so if you have that report ready to go and ready to reflect back on, you'll be able to get even more out of our discussion today. You can also get that 2023 definitive guide to Veeam, and you can sign up for a brand new trial of the Veeam data platform. So be sure that you've got those links open and saved and ready. And if all that cool content wasn't enough, we also have a $250 Amazon gift card that we will be giving away as a prize drawing at the end of our webinar. Now, of course, you do need to be here live in attendance with us at the webinar in order to win a prize, and all winners must meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. If you don't have those memorized, no problem, neither do I. The entire T's and C's are waiting for you in the handouts tab. Just click on over, scroll down, and you will find them waiting for you there. All right, well, we are cruising things along because I am so excited to bring out our expert speakers. So let's keep things rolling and get this conversation started. I am thrilled to introduce you all to our two experts from Veeam who are going to walk us through this really interesting report. That's Dave Russell, Vice President, Enterprise Strategy at Veeam, and Jason Buffington, Vice President, Market Strategy at Veeam. So we've got an all-star lineup here with us today. All right, well, Dave and Jason, I can't wait to dive in and hear what you've got planned for us today. I'm going to hand things on over to you. Take it away, Dave.
Hello and welcome to our special webinar, Revealing the Data Protection Trends for 2023. Jason, this information, this data is hot off the press.
So excited, so excited to finally be able a chance to reveal the data and the rest of the project to the folks at home. To get started, this is, Dave, the largest data protection project of its kind that we are aware of. 4,200 unbiased IT leaders responsible for data protection within their organizations across 28 different countries around the world. It's worth noting that in past years, last year, the second to largest report of its kind, had 3,400 respondents. And this year we added several hundred because in the past, the project was predominantly aimed at enterprises, so organizations with more than 1,000 employees. This year we added several hundred small and mid-sized organizations to really understand, do these questions, do these trends change based on the size of the org? For folks at home, you can actually follow along as we go through the data. You can hit that QR code in the lower right-hand corner, or just if you're on a browser, go to VEE.am/DPR23. Dave, you ready to get into it?
Yeah, let's dive in.
All right. First and foremost, one of the I think one of our favorite questions that we ask year over year. In fact, every year we ask what percentage of your production infrastructure is physical in the data center, virtual in the data center, or cloud hosted. And then, oh, by the way, every year we also ask, what do you think it's going to be in 2 years? So we can start to figure out trajectory. Well, we've been asking this question through those third-party research firms for the last 4 years running. And so you see this nice curve of the 4 green lines for the 4 actual numbers. And then in 22, they answered for what they thought it was going to be in 24. In 23, they answered for what they thought it was going to be in 25. And you interleave all this data together. And Dave, I'm not sure with 12,000 data points collected over 4 years running, I'm not sure I've ever seen charts that are quite as perfect as far as the shape of the data itself.
Yeah, it's really amazing. If you think about the pandemic first kicking in 2020, that's where we saw a big shift.
Yep.
Right? Organizations had to respond, had to accelerate, had to make some radical changes, and then it really leveled off. And if you look at the bars, even though they looks like there's some height differential, we're literally only talking 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points. So the data has landed in a very, very even mix. And Jason, I like to say that there's some myth busting we can do here. Part of the myth busting on the right-hand side is the cloud is already a reality. The cloud is in production usage for most of us. It's going to be slightly more than half of the workload in the very near future, meaning next year. But conversely, the data center is still around. The data center is not going away, and physical in the data center is not going away either.
Yeah, almost every time that we've been in this space, and both Dave and I each have about 30 plus years of experience, specifically within IT and most of it within backup itself. And usually when we see these major shifts from mid-range to NetWare to Windows to Vert and now to cloud, there was always this presumption that the last generation of architecture would at some point just turn off. You would decommission all of that last platform. And this is not true. First and foremost, by the way, it's never been wholly true on any of the platforms before it, right? So even when we were just talking about Vert, it's not like anybody turned off all their physical servers. But certainly today, what we're seeing is organizations with a cloud-first strategy, or in some cases, I like how some people put it as a cloud smart strategy. When they can stand it up in a cloud, they do, but they are not decommissioning physical and virtual machines in the data center at nearly the same rate. So as new cloud workloads come on, what it essentially does is just dilute the percentage of servers that are running physical and virtual. But bottom line, if you're taking quick notes, you should plan for about 50-50 on-prem versus cloud. And of that which is on-prem, about 50-50 between physical and virtual. And I think that's really key because as you think about what technologies you're using for protecting that diverse hybrid multi-cloud architecture, you need something that should be protecting all 3 of those with equitable capabilities.
Yeah, and an important point to point out here is that this isn't a Veeam survey, meaning Veeam customers. This is industry agnostic, and the party doing the research did not tip off that Veeam was behind it. It was completely anonymous.
Yep.
And these trends largely hold true in all geographies, all countries around the world, and mostly independent of company size, hugely independent for the most part across in different industry or verticals. So while every business is a little bit different, in aggregate, if you look at over 4,000 data points, what we see is an awful lot of consistency in most cases.
Yeah, cannot stress enough the unbiasedness of this data. It's why the data is only being interpreted by 2 former analysts, folks that are used to compartmentalization and looking at the data for its own sake as we look through that. In fact, probably the only lens that actually changes when you try to cut this in different ways is if you cut it by what their primary backup solution is, which is one of the other questions, you do see that, so for example, Veeam customers tend to have a slightly higher percentage of Vert because they're doing well at Vert. Folks that are using legacy backup solutions tend to have a slightly higher portion of physical servers in the environment because they're running legacy environments. And so you can kind of see how that lays out. But other than that, this data stands as is. And so it's interesting to see that because it affects all of us equally along the way. All right, so one of the first questions we ask is just this landscape question. But if we kind of dig in, the next step is the next question of the survey was to ask organizations, how do you feel about it? how do you think things are going, right? So this is not a scientific question. This is a perception, a sentiment question. And the sentiment is about 4 out of 5 organizations have dissat between what the business expects and what IT can deliver. And this goes on 2 different vectors. On the top, you see when systems break, because stuff breaks, there is an availability gap between how quickly the business leads process the IT systems to come back online versus how long it actually takes IT to get those systems back online, right? The bottom, also 4 out of 5 roughly, is a protection gap, right? So a protection gap means how much data can I afford to lose, and then comparing that with how often do you back up? And Dave, the example I always give for this is you ask a business leader, and if they say, well, I can't afford to lose anything, but if I'm push come to shove, I could lose 2 hours, 3 hours and be okay. Well, if IT's only backing you up once or twice a week, you too have a protection gap.
Yeah, this is amazingly shocking, shall I say, data
Sure.
points, because it is a sentiment, but it is a sentiment meaning it is a viewpoint expressed by the IT professionals, by the data center team that's in charge of providing protection solutions. They are self-reporting that they think on the top side that there's going to be a speed problem, how fast they can get things going, and on the bottom side that there's going to be a data loss problem. You add both of those up, and it says the vast majority, 4 out of 5 businesses, are going to miss their service level objective or their service level agreement, as reported by the very team that's in charge of actually delivering on that objective.
Yeah, you said that perfectly, Dave. Service level agreement, right? The whole idea of agreement is that the business sets an expectation. IT says we agree to deliver that. And yet 4 out of 5 organizations aren't. They aren't making good on their promise, right? It's not about hours or minutes. It's about this is the promise and failure to deliver. Okay, so that's the sentiment around data protection as we're coming into 2023 is we're multi and hybrid. It's here, not coming. And we're not happy with the results we're getting in data protection overall and data recoverability. So now let's start looking into what's going to drive better outcomes than this. To start with, one of the questions we've been asking for the last couple of years, and Dave, you before your Gartner days, you were at a company that was known for enterprise level backup, right? And so we've been asking folks for the last couple of years, what does the term enterprise backup mean to you? Choose all that apply. The long lines are on the right-hand side. But more interesting, the second part of the question was, if you were choosing a new enterprise backup solution today, which attribute would be most important as a prospective buyer? And it's sorted by those short lines that answer that. Now, it's a busy slide, and the slides you can all get from the report itself. But let's talk about what comes up as top of mind, Dave.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is it's very workload related, meaning newer workloads, infrastructure as a service, software as a service. Think, for example, Microsoft 365. This is likely a reflection on that their current enterprise solution doesn't provide very capable qualities associated with IaaS or SaaS. That really lends itself into the second one, meaning there's a causal relationship between I believe enterprise is protecting these cloud-hosted workloads, and therefore, if it does it well, it will be reliable, it will be consistent. The converse is probably why these both percolated up. I'm in charge now of protecting new IaaS and SaaS, and I have to have that reliable. I'm probably not experiencing that today.
Yeah, Dave, think back 15 years, right? Back when we were both analysts and we were watching companies that were trying to back up virtualization when it first came out, right? And so if you didn't have a virtualization capable product, if you were a legacy backup solution back then, you said, we'll just put an agent inside of every VM. We'll treat it like a physical server. It'll be fine. It was not fine. Right. And so you suffer the reliability that happens when you use legacy methods on a modern workload. It had happened 15 years ago with Virt. It's happening 15 years later as organizations are embracing IaaS and SaaS, especially IaaS. We'll just put an agent inside of every VM that's running in a cloud. That is not the ideal scenario. Your reliability will suffer. Your inability to recover is going to make you eventually reconsider and go to something new. So this was the top line is that their legacy enterprise solutions backing up their legacy workloads. On the top of the list, if enterprise is what they're thinking about, and we know that they're having reliability issues overall, no surprises here. But Dave, take a look at the big gap between it's got to work and I want it to work better.
Yeah, what you see in the first portion highlighted is that sprawl notion, that notion of I've got different locations, I'm doing, different. I'm a multinational corporation, perhaps, or I have a storefront in different areas. Versus, say, 10, 15 years ago, an enterprise solution was oftentimes deemed enterprise because of it could protect n number of terabytes or maybe even petabytes of data. It could have so many concurrent tape drives that it wrote data to. But that notion, while still on the list, Jason, it's much, much lower down on the list than is I got to go protect my workloads.
Yeah, when you think about some of the regulations we've seen around geo-sovereignty, where the data protection solution has to be within that same domain. When you think about, I'm going to use a best-of-breed technology and complement for Amazon for my Amazon workloads and Azure for my Azure workloads, you start to see some of the distribution of that tool set. And so it makes sense that enterprise would mean that it's okay to be distributed as long as you're providing comprehensive protection based on what was even higher in that priority list we talked about a few seconds ago. All right. That said, we did some myth busting. Let's now do some validation. One of the other terms that is synonymous with enterprise has to be heterogeneity, right? Because nothing is getting turned off. We're just adding the new stuff, right? So in this case, you do see an importance around NAS platforms and traditional Unix. You do see interest around those mission critical applications like Oracle and SAP HANA, as well as those other mission critical applications that are running in IaaS, that are running in SaaS. So certainly nobody ever turns anything off in an enterprise, and so a heterogeneity still becomes important across the way. But I think if you still boil it down to what is really going to drive that new enterprise backup consideration, it has to come down to first, protect IaaS and SaaS with equitable capabilities to how you're doing the data center. And then secondly, reliability, right? If it's enterprise quality, if it's enterprise grade, it's got to work every time, irregardless of the platform that data is running on. Amen, amen?
Amen.
All right. Okay, so that's the first one. Is now we're starting to kind of dig in a little bit. This was actually one of the new questions that we introduced for the 2023 survey instrument. And the question was, what's the likelihood that you'll change? Right? We know that 4 out of 5, so 80% of organizations are dissatisfied with what they have. We know the landscape is more diverse than it's ever been before. So it shouldn't surprise everybody. There's a great momentum for change. Now, what you see here is the probably nots, the probably wills, and then these, let's call them the neutrals. They haven't really committed to one camp or the other yet. So if we phase those out, I thought this was interesting. Dave, when you and I first started in this business, an organization, we're a Veritas shop or we're a Dell shop, right? So there was this thing that you never changed. That is not true today, is it?
No, and it was always a myth that no one changed backup solutions, but they were certainly stickier than they are today.
Yep.
And this sentiment here is very interesting in my mind. Less than 1 out of 10 says that they are very, very unlikely to make a change. Almost 3 out of 5 are expressing a real interest in looking at something. And in fact, when 16% says we definitely will, that's pretty shocking. You usually don't see that kind of shift, but a little plug for Veeam. I mean, that explains our market share rise. We've been experiencing people willing to go and shift from one solution to another. But this says, as an overall market, because of the dissatisfaction we saw in the prior charts, that people are looking for a better outcome.
Yep. Okay, so we now know that a high percentage intend to change. Let's find out what specifically is going to drive that change. And that is actually, Dave, one of your and my favorite questions we've been asking for the last several years. Which of the following would drive your organization to change its primary backup solution to a new solution or service? And it was pointed out when we first read this question off to some press a few weeks ago, where it is completely viable that someone would change from running their own backup software to using that backup software, but embracing backup as a service or DR as a service as a method or service of change. But that being said, they're going to make some kind of appreciable change in their environment. Let's take a look at the reasons why. No real surprise here on the top of the list. If enterprise is what they're thinking about, and we know that they're having reliability issues overall, no surprises here. But Dave, take a look at the big gap between it's got to work and I want it to work better.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. What we're seeing is we're going to miss our SLAs, is what the majority of respondents are saying on the prior slides. But yet the desire to improve that as being a primary driver is fairly low. I think it almost is indicting a statement of the problem. It's really kind of a state of the industry where the top goal is just to get the backups to be successful. And of course, that makes sense. You can't restore that which you haven't backed up or protected. So it all begins with backup. But in some regards, this shows just how much of a concern that the average organization really has.
You and I have talked about some of this data before. I think one of the things that I think about on this is that I think there's two modes for how we try to fix backup. When the platform that you're using is relatively stable, it's been around for a couple of years, it's well understood, then you're looking for qualitative improvement in the backup. So you're improving RPO by reducing data loss. You're improving RTO by how fast can you get it back again. So then SLAs really kind of come into the fray. In years when the platform has been radically shifting, like embracing IaaS, embracing SaaS, coming out of a pandemic, just trying to get it working again, then the focus is just, I got to make sure I've got all of my data backed up because I've had a different set of problems. And so I do think that there's kind of a expand and contract as the maturity of the market changes. And this is a year where a lot of folks are still struggling with protection of these modern workloads. Makes sense to me that reliability is going to be top of mind. In fact, you're going to see that a few more times before the charts are over. All right, but that's not the only meta trend that's driving change. I wish this was more definitive. I wish you could see the second silver bullet for change is. But this whole second band, it's two sides of a couple different coins. Dave, you want to walk us through some of these pairings?
Yeah, so Jason's color coded these intentionally, meaning the colors align to each other, but they're exactly the opposite. So we take the first one, diversify solutions, and then the bottom one of the same color you'll see is consolidate. I want a single solution. Then in kind of the orange next, you see, well, I want to move from cloud-based service to an on-prem solution. And then I want to move from on-prem to cloud. And then you get down into the green there. I want to deploy it as software only. And the other says, well, no, I actually want to deploy it as an appliance. And then in the middle, probably no one argues against reducing operational complexity, but it's just showing, Jason, that you can't solve for one thing. The market, despite having a lot of commonality in many of these major trends, still from an implementation perspective, they have their own way that they want to do it.
Yeah, the key takeaway here for me is that one, it has to work, right? Reliability was top of mind. But two, there is not a single form factor. There is not a single model that's going to hold true. And for every customer I've ever heard that said it must be an appliance, I can tell you at least one more customer who said there's no way I'm going to put a white box in my otherwise pure hardware environment, right? And you can make that same case all the way through this kind of listing. So I just like the fact that customers are asking for choice that fits how they need to manage the rest of their systems architecture and the rest of their management framework. So that said, let's do a little bit more myth busting though. So there are 3 different economic answers that were among the survey instrument, and all 3 show up on the bottom third of the list. Right. So and Dave, what I'm taking away from this is if it's not reliable and if it doesn't fit my way of delivering IT services and infrastructure, then saving money doesn't save me anything. Fair?
Yeah, that's right. The solution has to work. And we've seen in the prior slides that there's a strong belief that current solution or solutions, plural, are not working. So yeah, cost becomes secondary. First, you have to solve my problem. The industry is essentially saying my problems are not currently being met.
That's right.
So dissat.
Yeah. So you pull that together, if we're going to kind of give the headlines for this one, what's going to drive change in 2023? Reliability, right? It has to work. We've talked about some of those reasons already. And flexibility. It has to fit my way of delivering IT services. Cloud, on-prem, white box, software design, whatever, has to fit, right? Otherwise, if it's not a fit for me, don't really care how much it costs. All right. This last one, so there's three things we really wanted to explore as far as what's defining the market. We talked about two of them. The third one is another definition. In this case, we were asking organizations, or the panelists asked the organizations, what is the defining aspects of a modern or innovative data protection solution? Choose all that apply. You see those on the right. And then which one is most important? Now, this is a trend that we're going to see a couple times today, Dave, but what did you see out of those top two as they come together?
Yeah, I personally like this. The idea of an innovative or modern backup solution essentially has to play well with other areas of IT, other areas of the business.
Yep.
So everything we've covered up into this point is I need to solve my backup solution issue. I need to capture the data. I need to capture new kinds of workloads. Now, when it's what do I want out of an innovative solution, it's to be a good citizen with the rest of the IT ecosystem, in this case, security, or being able to integrate well with systems management. The reason I like that, Jason, is that backup is now not an island. It's no longer an isolated item, and we'll delve into that when we get to cyber ransomware. Sure. But here, what we're seeing is more of the organization is realizing backup can play a role. Therefore, the backup administrators are realizing I need a solution that can go and integrate with the rest of the ecosystem.
Totally agree. There's a little bit of other overlap that comes when we break down this data in different ways. One of them is also looking at the correlation between backup integrating with cyber, and then also the importance of orchestration, because certainly as we think about remediating from cyber events, whatever you can do to reduce time becomes important. Now, for those who have been on webinars with me before, I often will bring in a scouting example. I work a lot with youth. And when I teach the first aid merit badge, what I teach is your likelihood of survival is shrinking the time between snakebite and hospital, right? Snakebite and hospital. The way that you solve for ransomware, but pretty much any other disaster too, fire, flood, hurricane, etc., is how do we shrink the time between crisis and when the users can get back on and the business resumes functionality? And the answer to that has to be an orchestration. All right, Dave, if we aren't talking about ransomware, the last meta trend that you cannot get away from in 2023 has to be cloud. Now, there's a couple different things in cloud that I think are worth noting here. I personally love the idea of cloud-hosted infrastructure for disaster recovery. I'm an old-fashioned BCDR guy myself. And so the idea of, in some cases, if you're running multiple data centers for DR, love that. There's a huge amount of agility that you can get when you manage all the pieces end to end. But for a lot of mid-sized organizations that don't have a secondary data center, or enterprises that have an aging secondary DR site, leveraging cloud-hosted infrastructure when you need it and then not paying for it when you don't can be a huge accelerant for BCDR. We're going to talk more about that later. On the other end of this, every cloud company has a utility that'll help you get your data from your on-prem to the cloud that they run. Can't get it back again, but you can get it as a one-way trip. It's kind of a Hotel California thing. And in between there, love the fact, we talked about this earlier, standardizing between on-prem and IaaS and SaaS, right? So we talked about that 3 or 4 times already in this talk. But Dave, this one seems to be something which is really underestimated as to strategic importance when we have normal conversations, and yet it shows really well in the data. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I like this one, meaning that move workloads from one location to another, in this case, one cloud hyperscaler to another, because at its essence, backup is a data ingest engine, data management facility, and then ability to write data to another location. That means it's a great migration tool. It's a great cloud equalizer. Mm-hmm. If you want to move from one cloud to another or just copy data from one to another. And vice versa, we could also give examples of repatriating data, which we've covered in other research.
Sure.
It's a very real notion to develop in the cloud, but you always had the intention to run on premises, is but one example. So to me, I like this because it represents a mature use case, even beyond traditional recovery.
Yeah, I was doing a CIO event last week, and they were talking about repatriation as if it was cloud remorse. The idea of, oh, we screwed up, we got to bring the data back. And I told people, I said, we need to get rid of that as a negative term. It should be about fluidity. Where should the workload live at any point in time based on the best needs and outcomes and economics and performance considerations to the business? But oh, by the way, you ain't going to get that from a native cloud provider. Their job is to get your data into their cloud, not to move it around once it's there. So, all right. So macro trends we should be thinking about as far as what does modern data protection mean? Modern data protection needs to be part of your cyber strategy. Modern data protection should integrate BCDR and systems management within the same set of lenses. And then lastly, a wide range of cloud capabilities, both for handling production clouds as well as enabling protection clouds, if you will. And that's going to bring us into kind of our next deeper dive. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into a couple of these areas based on how the research laid out. Anytime that you see these 6 bars that you see here and the annual numbers underneath, this is again one of those where we've asked the same question year over year over year over year, 4 years in a row. And in this case, and then each time we also ask, what do you think it's going to be 2 years later? We interleave that as we talked about before. And so now you get this wonderful 6-year run rate. Question here is around primary method of backing up data. And in the dark, you see those organizations that are only using on-prem technology. So that can be disk, that can also be tape, take it out of the drive, put it on the shelf, that counts. As opposed to in the lighter green, organizations that are using cloud as part of their solution, which could include either a cloud object storage tier and or a turnkey backup as a service, BaaS type offering. Dave, when we started this question in 2020, about 3 out of 5 were cloudy, 2 out of 5 not yet. We fast forward down, and now we're seeing it's really more around, let's call it 3 out of 4 that are cloudy, 1 out of 4 wondering why they're looking for a job. I mean, only using on-prem tech. So this is an exciting time for the market. Now, we didn't see as much shift as we might have thought, and yet it's a pretty consistent intent. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we saw the jump 2020, 2021, pandemic spurred a lot of change, but then very, very consistent at 66 and 67%, only 1 percentage point varying off here and there. So now 3 years going, we've got a lot of people with a great deal of cloud experience. What that tells me is that the fact that they're looking ahead 1 and 2 years and want to consume even more means that their cloud activities have been going well for them. They've done the correct thing, which is probably not change 100% of your environment. They've been responsible. They've been looking in, investigating, piloting projects, having success with that. And it's gone so well that they expect more and more of the workload to go to the cloud. And probably need to mention another reason that could be driving this is continued supply chain issues that many organizations face. Rather than putting in an order where literally it could take you 12 months or longer to get that gear, sign a contract today and get that at your disposal suddenly tomorrow or even the same day.
Right.
And, no idle gear either. If you don't have to go over provision or pre-order for something. So I think there's a few dynamics. It's success that you've had in the cloud, and then just the macroeconomic realities of the ability to even get gear, regardless of whether or not you've got the money to buy it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good read. For the last 2 years, you're right. It's been at 67 and 33. There's actually a rounding, a little anomaly there. So I guess there's a half point of difference in that span. And yet 22 going to 24, that 2-year plan, they thought they're going to jump another 12 points, right? This year's data, they thought they were going to jump another 7 points along the way. So there is still that interest. And yet nobody is saying we're going to turn off the data center, right? Or at least very, very few. Few folks make headlines on that. But that is not the norm. The norm is to embrace the tool that works. We're going to Come back to that theme a little bit later. Now, this is backup, right? So backup is tactical. Get your data out of the building and then figure out where you're going to recover to later. Speaking of where you're going to recover to, we do have a second question on this. Now, this is around disaster recovery, not just backup. And when you look at where does the self-managed data centers, and again, if you have multiple data centers and you have the skills for this, there's a huge amount of agility that comes out of, the East Coast fails over to the West Coast and vice versa, and the branches fail over to a regional data center of choice. There's a huge amount of agility that comes out of that. And yet, when you see where that is from a usage perspective, it's relatively flat. 30, 28, 34, 24. So there's fluctuation plus or minus 5 points. But look at where the growth is. All the growth in business continuity disaster recovery, especially for mid-sized organizations who don't have multiple data centers, who don't have BCDR experts on staff, their growth is 23, 30, 36, 47, 53, 55. The growth in BCDR as a capability, you can directly attribute to the cloud provides a secondary data center when you want it, and experts provide expertise on demand without having to have full-time staff. I am very excited to see the momentum in BCDR overall, and I want to blame a good chunk of that on DRaaS. What are your thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, I think it comes down to two things that you mentioned. One is most organizations, you'll hear the CIO say, I don't want to be in the real estate business.
Yep.
I don't want to have brick and mortar that I'm constantly paying for, even if I'm not actively using it. So there's that component, but then there's the skills or expertise component of either I've got the right team, but I'd rather have them doing other activities, or we don't have the expertise to design a comprehensive disaster recovery plan. We need to import that capability. And oh, by the way, while we're doing that, we might as well get more of a concierge-like experience where they can handle this cradle to grave.
Absolutely. No, not sure we should use the word grave when we're talking about BCDR. I mean, the whole idea is to avoid the grave, but I get what you're saying. All right, let's we've been talking about the cloud as a hero scenario, and the problem when cloud first came out as part of data protection was that too many people said that because cloud is so great as a hero scenario, it's going to kill things like tape. I can tell you 2,100 organizations in this particular question that will tell you that 2023 is not the year that tape dies. And I'm going to go on a limb. I'm going to be risky here and say that I don't think 2024 is going to be that year either. Here's the question. In addition to whatever disk-based backup you're running, so disk is almost always the gold standard on how you're first going to protect data. Along with that, approximately what percentage of your production data is also backed up to tape and or to cloud? No disagreement at all on cloud being ahead on this one. 63% of data at some point gets written to a cloud, whereas 50% of production data still goes to cloud. Now, my gut check says I think that should be closer to 35 to 40. Dave, I think you're happy with the 50% number, but again, tape is not the four-letter word that some people used to think it was.
Yeah, it really comes down to right tool, right task. And the reality is of that 63% that's cloud-based, the greatest consumer of tape-based solutions are the hyperscalers. So there's a very, very good likelihood that once you wrote it to a cloud provider, ultimately on the back end or over time, they wrote it to tape-based infrastructure as well. But there are no bad technologies, right? It's just using things the right way for whatever your requirements are. Still a lot of attractive properties associated with physical tape.
Absolutely, especially when we start talking about ransomware. We're going to get into that in just a minute. But it is hard to be more air gappable than take the tape out of the drive and put it on a shelf, right? I mean, that is like the purest definition that I can think of for what an air gap ought to look like. The other thing I got to mention, you mentioned the hyperscalers. One of the things I'm starting to hear a lot more about from managed service providers that are offering backup as a service and DR as a service are those organizations offering TAS, tape as a service, where, you're backing up and you're replicating to them on an hourly or daily basis, but once or twice a month, they're doing a tape for you, especially for industries that are highly regulated. And also, by the way, it ensures that no matter what happens, if you want to take all your data out of one cloud and then put it in another, you have not lost long-term retention. right? Because you still have 5 years worth of tapes. And oh, by the way, you're not swapping the cartridges. You're not handling the cleaning. And the tape is also in another location than where physical data is, which means you get all those regulatory compliance around separation and geo sovereignty. So lots of great reasons that tape in a cloud or from a cloud is just as powerful. What you shouldn't be thinking about is cloud instead of a tape. Use them both for what they're good for. All right, we do have a detour though before we get into cyber. I said we are going to cover that, but there's one more thing we want to lean into first. When we talk about modern workloads, and certainly cloud is a modern accelerator for that, we do want to put a nod in for containers. Got to admit, I didn't grow up in the DevOps community, so I'm always surprised at the vast percentage of organizations that really have wholly contained or wholly embraced containers. Dave, you've been watching this for a while.
Yeah, the shift left notion or the DevOps or XOps, pick your ops, is a lot more in play than most would realize. The traditional infrastructure operations teams are oftentimes thinking containers are 2 years away. The application teams are thinking we've been in production for 2 years.
Yep.
So what you see here, if you go around, actually, if we start up at basically 12 o'clock, only 1% out of nearly 2,100 respondents said they have no plans. I'm going to go on a limb and say that they probably are mistaken, but nonetheless, this is a sentiment survey, and only 1% out of 2,100 approximately say no plans. 8% said, well, we're interested, but we don't have a deployment plan, at the moment. Then if you keep going around counterclockwise, 40%, 4 out of 5 say we're not in production yet, but we're planning to. And over half at 52, they're already in production to some degree or another. So I remember many years ago now, I think it was 8 years ago when I was a Gartner analyst, and at a conference, one of my colleagues was on stage and he said, how many of you are running containers? Bear in mind, Jason, this is 8 years ago. Nobody's hand went up. There was probably at least 500 people in the audience. Mm-hmm. He said, well, I got news for you. If you have developers in your organization, you already have containers. You just don't know about it yet. So pretty clairvoyant statement, because that's what the data is really supporting here. If you look on the right-hand side, it's the same data. We just broke that out by size of company. What you see in the color coding is the exact same. That lighter green on the bottom, that's who's in production today. I don't think it's surprising, Jason, that the larger organizations are slightly ahead there at 54%, but that is not to say that a smaller organization is not participating in this container activity. 39% are in production, with 42% for even the smaller organizations saying we're actively planning. Yeah. The net to me is on all that, regardless of your company size, containers are happening. I like to use that as an evangelical point to our current backup administrators, our current infrastructure operations colleagues, to say there's a good chance, if your organization is even remotely like all of these others that we've surveyed here, that you've got a container backup notion that has yet to fully unfold if you're not actively involved in it. So go ask around. Someone's probably running containers in production in your shop already.
Totally agree. Really well said. Dave, our first data point talked about the mass shifts between physical and virtual and cloud. And then we spent some time talking about what the backup ramifications are of that landscape. If we use this as the landscape of most people are running containers, those that aren't are getting ready to, if that's the landscape of the problem, then the next question becomes, then who's responsible for backing that data up? And then that little blank space on the right-hand side, we're going to explore how. But let's talk about the who. Part of me is just giddy over the fact that these are nearly perfect quadrants, right? Plus or minus 2 points of exactly 25, 25, 25, 25. And yet, part of me kind of resembles that this looks a lot like it did in virtualization when you didn't really know how to back it up at all.
Yeah, what's interesting is that the top two are in the infrastructure and ops teams, meaning the storage admins, the backup teams. So everyone tends to approach things from the lens of their own training and trade. The backup team wants to use a backup solution. The storage admins are thinking, let's capture this at the array or LUN level. Then at the bottom side, you've got the applications teams. Kubernetes admins may be thinking of, I need a different kind of a solution. Maybe I can try to natively do it through something provided by an interface of my Kubernetes provider. Then the application admins may be thinking, oh, well, I can do this via my app tool itself. So to your point about history repeating itself, those that are solving the problem today, they're each trying to do it in a different way with tools and techniques that they're familiar with.
Yeah, and I just kind of think through these scenarios, right? So the app owner is saying, hey, I'm going to back up the database, and then I'll just rebuild the app and throw the database back in, right? Or the Kubernetes guy is saying, oh, I'll launch a new version of Kubernetes, and then I'll just redrop the. I mean, there's still so much effort involved in that. The one that I actually care for the least probably is the storage admin, right? So I'm going to back up the LUN. And then surely when I power that LUN back up, everything will be there, right? Because I'm counting on crash consistency, which is a lovely idea when you're talking about a transactional application, but we don't have time to go into that. All right, so let's look at how they are actually doing it. So here's the second part of the question, and again, Dave kind of sees some of the same kinds of flaws here. We did keep the colors aligned, so you do see the database itself being backed up about 22% of the time, 47%. Not sure I know how to spell Kubernetes, but I can back up the LUN. I can spell LUN. And going from there, 4%. Well, do some myth busting up here, and then we'll talk about what's left on the chart.
Yeah, it was very popular, well, even today, but especially the last couple of years, to say there's going to be no stateful data in a container.
Right.
Some of these containers might have a half-life literally measured in seconds to minutes. The reality, though, that what we're seeing in production is that there is stateful data in a container. They persist more than just seconds or milliseconds. Therefore, they do have data that is important to back up. And to your point, now, if you go around clockwise, rather, that 47%, that's like saying, well, I have a crash consistent copy of my data. I grab the bits, but bits don't equal a business process. Bits don't equal an application end to end being able to get back up and running. So it is an attempt to try to look at how can we handle this without necessarily being able to deliver on the end service desire.
Yep. All right. So time check here. We're about 45 minutes or so into our session. Let's go into what's probably the ugly elephant in the room, and that is outages, server infrastructure. And for most folks, that's going to look like cyber. So we've been asking the same question for the last 3 years running, and the question is, over the past 2 years, which were the most common causes of outages in your organization? And those are the long lines. And then on the short lines, what was the cause of the most impactful outage in each of 2020, 2 years ago's research, 2021, last year's research, and then now in 2022. Dave, let's first talk about those long lines, because I know it's sexy and good press and hype to talk about ransomware, but these lines don't look that different on that right-hand side.
Yeah, they really don't. What's interesting is everything that we used to worry about taking out a data center or a server still can happen. Despite the improvement in redundant power supplies or higher quality, higher mean time to failure between components, we still have various kinds of traditional, I'll call them, issues that still occur. Cyber rises up to the top, so it's almost like everything that we're used to worrying about, we still have to worry about. And it gets worse because unlike a traditional outage, which might take down a server, along comes cyber, which usually increases the scope of the event dramatically, could be your entire server farm if you're a large shop.
Yeah, and we don't have time to really talk through it today, but the other thing, which is a nuance between most of these other things and cyber, is, if you have fire or flood, the servers that are crispy are the ones you have to fail over. The ones that are dripping wet are the ones you have to fail over. The problem with cyber is that part of that outage is just trying to triage how bad was it? How wide was it? Because those servers are not dripping or crispy in most cases. So now that said, the most impactful outage 3 years in a row, ransomware. All right, so let's get into how bad this is. Here comes the negative part of today's talk, and we're going to start with organizations were asked how many ransomware attacks has your organization suffered in the last 12 months? One of the beauties of an unbiased blind survey is we do get some great honesty in some of the answers that you might not see in the open press. When this question was published in last year's in the DPR 22 report, 24% of organizations said they had not been hit. Now, of course, that means 76%, 3 out of 4 organizations had been hit at least once. Dave, that number has gone down from 24% having not been hit down to only 15%. What is that? 1 in 6 environments that have not been hit. And even that's probably optimistic.
Yeah, unfortunately, while bad, meaning 15% saying they weren't hit, it could be worse than that, because if you think about a larger organization, whoever was responding to this blind survey may not have had visibility across another business unit, another geography, or just their entire footprint in their organization. So that is a best case scenario, and it's obviously poor statistics. Even worse when you start to scroll towards the middle of the screen, where the 2 highest or most common responses were I got hit 2 times or 3 times. That's almost half, 49%, almost half said I got not just hit, I got hit 2 or 3 times. And obviously it gets worse and worse as you go further to the right. But to me, this says, unfortunately, Jason, as an industry, these aren't Veeam customers, this is an industry-wide survey, the industry is currently losing the war on cyber.
Yeah. I'm going to throw one more twist on that knife on that left-hand side, though. We talked about maybe you don't know because of a different part of the org. Our friend Chris Hoff at Veeam talks about, the average gestation of once the bad actor is in your environment before you find out about it can be up to 200 days. Right. So I'm also thinking some of that 15%, they've been penetrated. They just don't know about it because the bad actor is still in a lurking mode. They just haven't been asked for that ransom yet. So lots of reasons why we are absolutely losing on this race. So if this data shows ransomware is a when, not an if, and if that's true, then let's get worse. This is the second worst slide in the deck. Here comes the worst one. When an attack happens, organizations were asked, thinking about the most significant ransomware attack over the last 12 months, what percentage of the organization's production data was encrypted or destroyed? Right. And you can see the chart here, the breakout, about a fourth of folks said less than 20% of the data. 7% of folks said they got just about everything. Right. Mm-hmm. And there's a mix in between. But on average, 39%. So roughly 2 out of 5 hard drives, home directories, databases, whatever you want to call it, 2 out of 5 shredded along the way. And Dave, it gets worse because organizations were then asked what percentage of the affected data were you able to recover, and they were only able to get back about half. So if you lose just under half of the 39% that was affected, back of the napkin gets you around 17%-ish. So roughly a sixth of your data is gone, irrecoverable, non-retrievable, didn't come back from backup, no copies out there, whatever it is, you lose a sixth of your data, Dave.
Yeah, these are horrible numbers. And I busted out my handy Hewlett-Packard calculator here just to do some of this algebra. And if you think over on the left-hand side, the worst case scenario, meaning more than 80% of my data was affected, encrypted or destroyed, it's easy to say, well, that was only 7%. That's essentially 1 out of 14 organizations.
Never come back.
That's amazing. And we're talking a sample size of 1,600. So of that 1,617, 14%, that's 226 organizations that lost the vast majority of their data from the initial event, meaning it got encrypted or destroyed. On average, you could only bring half of that data back. Literally, and that's a go out of business strategy. And this whole question set here is just asking about the single most impactful event, not every event that happened in the last 12 months. There is nobody that can afford to lose, on average, 39% and only get half of that amount back for every incident, and they're most likely going to have 2 to 3 incidents in a 12-month period.
Yeah, we're going to provide a link for it at the end, but we did actually do a whole other project. When we saw this data last year in the DPR22 project, it was so interesting to us that we then went off and contracted another survey with a different analyst firm to go and get 1,000 organizations, all of whom had suffered at least one ransomware attack in the prior 12 months, and then get statistics on them. And so there's a huge amount of data that you can find from there. But I would tell you, go look at your homework. Go look at the your homework is go think about how much data was affected last time you had one of those. How much data could you have gotten back, or if you haven't had that exercise yet, take 55% against whatever the number was that you think was affected, and understand how would you get that back if you needed to. So super scary results along the way. Look, there's a lot of things that are scary around cyber and ransomware, and you can talk about lost productivity and talk about lost reputation when you have to do a disclosure, and some businesses never come back from it. There are some perhaps less appreciated impacts that come from cyber along the way. Dave, you've been talking about shifts and drivers in digital transformation for several years. But one question that was new this year was, what's the biggest challenge to your digital transformation, your IT modernization strategy? I was a little surprised to find out it's because they're too busy remediating or they're too busy defending against or preparing for. They don't have any money left to do the modernization that they want. Is that a good read, and how real is that?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is very accurate, and it's saying we can't transform the business. We can't keep up with different business expectations, different trends, because we're so busy just trying to operationally focus on what we have. So it's a huge opportunity cost. An opportunity cost with a lot of effort, a lot of resources going towards it. And yet, as we're seeing in the prior slides, we're not necessarily as an industry doing very well, despite all the focus, the increased attention, and simultaneously, it is not allowing the business to grow, transform, or change as many of the businesses need to in these last few years in the pandemic to be, frankly, just competitive, much less try to make advances in their own business models.
Okay, so Dave, I think we're in about 52 minutes in, if the clock is right. So just want to wrap up with a few last thoughts. So we're talking about ransomware as one crisis. Ransomware is a disaster. It is not the only disaster. We've talked already about, fire happens, flood happens, databases crash. There's lots of other crises to be solved. And so these last two slides we wanted to explore look at how are you going to fail over when bad things happen? Not if, when bad things happen. It's been an interesting shift, actually about 12 points of spread between this year's version of the question and last year's version, where for 2023, barely over half, 54% of organizations plan on doing BCDR to secondary infrastructure on premise, whether that's the original metal wiped, whether that's a secondary data center, or it's drop ship new metal in the day that you declare a crisis. And I've been in organizations that have done all three. But even then, the majority of data that's going to repopulate those on-prem servers is actually coming from a cloud. In other cases, folks have been, asking themselves, why BAS when you can DRAS, right? The idea instead of saying, I'm just going to fail over to a cloud. My data is already up there. I'm just going to power it up. And so radical shift to see that nearly 50% of organizations using cloud infrastructure for DR. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, and year over year, these percentages shifted to favor more of activity in the cloud. I think it's a similar kind of notion where people tried at first a certain amount of cloud capabilities. It went well for them, and they deployed additional, or their expectation is they will go further into embracing cloud technologies. And I think that's a responsible thing. Don't just trust blindly, verify it for yourself. But in aggregate here, of over 1,400 respondents, the survey says that they're having favorable results or experiences in the cloud.
Yep. Last piece of this, last thing we want to cover is if we're going to talk about, this is the where, let's look at the how, right? And so when organizations are looking at how are you going to fail over in the event of a crisis at scale, Dan, I got to tell you, I feel bad for the 30% of folks that say, hey, surely the original IT folks, they're going to be around and available and not have anything else going on. So they're going to manually reconfigure everything. during a crisis. That just seems like a resume generating event.
Yeah, it really is. It means when your boss is either standing over your shoulder literally or asking for constant updates at a time when you're trying to find ISO images, remember domain masking configuration issues, where's that, manual or PDF of something that I used about a year ago, the last time I did this. It's really asking a lot of the team, and to your point, it might be different people, different administrators. They're trying to respond to this. They're trying to ask them to literally do this by hand for areas that may not be their expertise under the worst of circumstances.
Yeah, when you were back in IBM and TSM, did a little bit of work with IBM BCRS. And one of the first lessons they teach is don't expect any of the experts who are there on Friday to be there on Monday. Not just for the dire loss of life scenarios, but just, down in Texas, we have floods, right? And if downtown Houston is underwater, I guarantee your house is underwater too. You ain't coming into work that day because mama needs that living room without water. Right. So there's all kinds of reasons why those experts are not going to be there. And that's true whether you're doing manual reconfigure or whether you're even just trying to find and run scripts. Now, the good thing about scripts is, nothing in IT has changed since the day you deployed the app. So I'm sure those scripts are going to work just great. Or you could do like what 18% of the smart kids are doing and use orchestrated workflows. And certainly I hope that year over year, we continue to see that number rise. Okay, so we're on a time check, but I do want to make sure that we get a chance to plug. We've talked about a few other research items along the way. So this is the Data Protection Trends 2023 reveal. We've talked about ransomware, so if you haven't seen that one, go check out the ransomware trends for 2022. Also, if you're a Salesforce user, we did look at some of those personas and how they're affecting the protection of what is, for many folks, the crown jewel of SaaS. In other organizations, we also looked at IaaS and SaaS and PaaS and IT Ops and how they're doing cloud protection and production along the way. So lots of good data. If you have questions about anything that you saw here, you can always send those to strategicresearch@veeam.com. Speaking of questions, though, do we have any from the chat group that we want to cover really quick?
Yeah, here's what I thought was interesting, Jason. It said, you mentioned that you can cut this down by verticals, by geographies. Were there major differences, and if so, where? I'll take a stab. I know we've got some from a vertical perspective that I think you should touch on, but by and large, there were not huge variances. And that's true across geography, and that's true across company size. But some verticals are different than others, Jason.
They are. So, for example, in the healthcare space, we saw that a lot of healthcare is a little bit more pro-cloud, right? In financial, the data tends to be a little bit more data center centric along the way. One of the statistics that's in the report itself talks about an average of 6.5% year over year budget increase. And that's true in the private sector. And yet in our public sector cut, we found that is not the case. Public sector is not growing data protection budgets at the same rate that private sector is. So yeah, so there's some vertical stuff in there. We also talked a little bit about some segments. So smaller organizations are a little bit more tactical in their cloud, and yet they're not as advanced in some of the bleeding edge technologies like containers. But overall, plus or minus 5 to 7 points on most questions, it's a pretty even mix.
Brilliant. Well, let's end it with that, and be sure to encourage everyone download the report, the full report. It's available at that URL. And we definitely want to thank everyone for joining us on this Revealing the Data Protection Trends for 2023 webcast. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you guys. What a great presentation, Dave and Jason. I saw a couple comments coming in saying how much everyone was getting out of the conversation, and I absolutely have to agree. I think my brain is all lit up and buzzing now. Speaking of which, please do, again, be sure that you're heading over to that handouts tab. Make sure that you've got that 2023 Data Protection Trends report, everything that we just covered and more, all the graphics that you were seeing up on the slides there for you to dig into. You can also get that 2023 2023 Definitive Guide to Veeam, and be sure to sign up for that new trial of the Veeam data platform. So lots waiting for you in the handouts tab. All right, now we have a $250 Amazon gift card that we're going to give away before we all head out and on about our Fridays on this lovely afternoon, or as I said, morning or evening, wherever you're chiming in from. Our next winner, who is here live and present with us at the webinar, is Gary Metalista. Gary Metalista of New Jersey. You have won a $250 Amazon gift card. Congratulations, Gary. We will follow up with you after we wrap, so stay tuned for that. All right. Well, with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to once again thank Veeam for the report and for making this webinar possible, for taking some time to walk us through that report, which brings me to our wonderful speakers, Dave and Jason. I want to once again thank you. What an incredible conversation. That was so interesting to just sit in and explore with you. Speaking of exploring, I always have to stop and pause and say a big thank you to all of you. We got some great questions in. Now, I know we didn't get to all the questions. We are going to make sure that those get sent to the Veeam team, since we won't have time to respond on live chat now as we wrap up, but we'll make sure that you get some answers back over email. So keep any last questions, feel free to get them into the questions window. We'll make sure they get to Veeam. And you'll get some follow-up. But the interaction today was a lot of fun. I was loving seeing the comments from the crowd and all of you out there clearly getting a lot out of this. I hope that there's some insights that you can take back to your organizations and maybe mull over a little bit and see what's going to settle in and make sense for you and your team. And, you know, if nothing else, we've had a great conversation today, and that's always a nice way to wrap up a week. All right. Well, team, thank you again for joining us. Thanks for being a part of our day today. And I hope that I get to see you all at a webinar again soon. And until then, I hope you have an absolutely beautiful end to your day.